War of 1812, also known as America's Second War for Independence, because we are once again fighting the foe that are the British. But just think of how cool our voices would sound had we not won the Revolution, or even the War of 1812. Oh, I just ruined it for you. I'm sorry. I always wanted a British accent. So we'll start with the causes of the War of 1812. The little man in France, Napoleon, is once again trying to conquer the world, again, compensating for the fact that he is a little man. So he wants big land. So he's in battle with Britain, because when are France and Britain not fighting? I mean, they're always fighting. Can't these two just get along? Well, I guess not. So in 1806, in the throes of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain issues the Orders in Council. And this requires neutral countries such as the United States to obtain a license from British authorities before trading with France or French colonies. As you can imagine, this was outrageous. Britain wasn't our mother anymore. We shouldn't have to ask them to trade with France, but yet that's exactly what the Orders in Council was asking us to do. So this was quite frustrating to many Americans. At the same time, the British are impressing American sailors. No, they're not showing off for them. They're actually boarding American vessels, kidnapping American sailors, and then forcing them to serve in the British Royal Navy. So as you can see, things are starting to heat up, and this is only cause number one. Cause number two, the Chesapeake Leopard affair. So June 21st, 1807, the Leopard, which you can see in the picture there, the blue ship, is kind of patrolling the waters off the Atlantic and in the Chesapeake Bay. And they happen upon the American vessel, aptly called the Chesapeake. We're so original in our naming. And the Leopard captain decides to not only fire upon the Chesapeake, but also board the Chesapeake. He claimed he was looking for Royal Navy deserters. Yeah, whatever. The captain of the Chesapeake, unfortunately, was wholly unprepared to go to battle, and he actually surrenders the ship after only the first shot. Not really your good old American try. And after everything's said and done, we have 3 men that are dead, 18 that are wounded. The captain of the Leopard arrests 4 of our guys and brings them back to Britain, tries them, and hangs one of them on top of all that. The British Foreign Office say, oh, I'm sorry, it was such a big mistake, but we weren't having it. Jefferson issues a pretty stern response. He forbids British ships to dock in American ports, and he orders the state governors to call up 100,000 militiamen in preparation for possible war or a land attack by the British. And so this leads us into the Embargo Act of 1807. This was a pretty bold statement. It forbade all international trade to and from American ports. And Jefferson hoped that Britain and France would be persuaded of the value and rights of neutral commerce, because we were desperately trying to stay neutral in this fight. But it was Britain and France were making it very, very difficult for us to do so. Now, the Embargo Act was very hurtful on the American economy, especially with the merchants in New England, since it forbade all international trade to and from American ports. They essentially lost their trading partners, and there were a lot of smuggling and loopholes that were trying to be found. So the Embargo Act is so unpopular that it actually gets replaced with the Non-Intercourse Act. And no, it's not what you think. It's a lot less interesting than that. So this goes ahead and replaces the Embargo Act. And so what it said is that if either the British or the French, dropped trade restrictions against the United States, the U.S. Congress would in turn resume non-intercourse with the opposing power. So basically, if you say, and France ended up doing this, Napoleon said that he would stop restrictions against U.S. trade. And so then President James Madison blocked all trade against Britain November of 1809. And so this remains in place until 1812. So we're trading with the French, but not with the British. We are still holding fast to our celibacy or non-intercourse with Great Britain as a result of this act. So some unexpected consequences of the Non-Intercourse Act. was crankiness. No. New England is forced to become self-sufficient again. So they have to open up a lot of their old factories. They have to start pumping out products because they're not getting it from trade. And so this starts to lay the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution that will soon take off, that we'll learn about in Unit 3. And so it's just really ironic because Jefferson, who's kind of, a man of the common person, the small-time farmer, he was really suspicious of merchants and wealth and the elite, really actually supports this as a result of the Non-Intercourse Act because we're not trading, so we're having to make so many products on our own. And this is something that Alexander Hamilton really wanted, not Jefferson. And then the last cause of the war was the British instigation of the Indians. And so what was happening here is Britain was actually encouraging Native American hostility against American expansion in the West. So Canada is still a British colony at this point, and there are a lot of Native Americans in our Northwest Territory as well as in Canada. And the British were kind of instigating or whispering in the ear of the Indians, hey, go fight the Americans for your land, kind of stop their westward expansion. And so this ends up resulting in a great battle. William Henry Harrison, who's the governor of the Indiana Territory at this time, invites Native Indian chiefs in the area to Fort Wayne, Indiana, to sign away 3 million acres of land to the United States government. And so some of the local tribes in the area, like the Shawnees, get wind of this, and their chief, Tecumseh, is not very happy about this signing away of Indian land. So he organizes a confederacy of Indian tribes to fight for their land. And it's a bitter battle. But William Henry Harrison is successful. He defeats Tecumseh and Tecumseh's brother at what became to be known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. And William Henry Harrison does such a fantastic job. He becomes a household name, a national hero, and it will eventually propel him to the presidency in 1840. And his campaign slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So catchy. They just don't make them like they used to anymore. Tyler would end up being William Henry Harrison's vice president. And he would actually be important because Harrison would die shortly after taking the presidency. And so Tyler would have to take over. But enough on that story later on. Okay. So after the Battle of Tippecanoe, there's an election in Congress, and it ushers in the very powerful Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. And they are known as war hawks because they are very much advocating for war against Britain because they're just giving us such a hard time. And Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun put a lot of pressure on this guy, James Madison. You may remember him as the father of the Constitution. Shy, awkward, not a very good speaker, but incredibly brilliant. And so Madison will eventually succumb to the pressure put on him by Clay as well as Calhoun. And on June 18th, 1812, he will sign a declaration of war against Britain. Congress will ultimately vote for war, but the House and the Senate are pretty bitterly divided on the issue. And most Western and Southern congressmen support the war, Democratic Republicans, while Federalists, mainly New Englanders who relied heavily on trade with Britain, will accuse the war advocates or the war hawks of using an excuse of sailor impressment to promote their expansionist agenda. So a lot of rivalry here going on. Okay, so here are our problems going into the war. We have 12 ships versus 800. Now, granted, Britain is fighting a war with France right now, but that won't always be the case. Americans are not too keen on a draft. They prefer to enlist in their rather disorganized state militias. We're still not very unified, and there isn't a standing army. We don't have a lot of money. Economic woes are plaguing us. There's a lot of currency in circulation, which means that it's not worth a lot. And we don't have much money because our revenue from imports is down because of the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of regional disagreements, North versus South, about going into this war. So here's a map of the kind of the battles of the war itself. So you can see most of it takes place in the Great Lakes region of the Northwestern Territory, with the exception of one big battle down in New Orleans. But the vast majority of it is up in that Great Lake region. Now, the war doesn't go very well for us. In fact, in August 24th, 1814, as you can see depicted here in the picture, the British actually move into Chesapeake Bay and onto the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. They capture it and they burn it to the ground. The Capitol building and the White House are completely destroyed. And the folklore goes that as James Madison and his wife Dolly were running out of the White House, Dolly ran back into the burning building to save the American flag, which she draped around her and carried with her out of burning Washington. And of course, we would rebuild it, but it was very sad nonetheless because the White House and the Capitol had just been recently completed. We do have some wins, though. We have the Battle of Fort McHenry on September 13th, 1814. Baltimore's Fort McHenry withstands 25 hours of bombardment by the British Navy. And the following morning, the fort soldiers hoisted an enormous American flag. And it was such an awesome sight that it inspires Francis Scott Key to write the poem titled The Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, can you see? Yeah, I'm trying out for American Idol. I appreciate your encouragement. But anyway, so now you know where the Star-Spangled Banner comes from. So the next time you sing it at the Braves game, go Braves, you know exactly the events that inspired the song. So some battles wage on. You know, we win some, we lose some. That's pretty much the case. And what ends up happening is peace talks begin in Ghent, which is Belgium today, home to amazing frites, which we call French fries, mussels, and probably the world's best beer, which you wouldn't know about until you're 21, of course. So Britain moves for an armistice after the failure of the assault on Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Negotiations follow. We basically give up our demands to end impressment, which is pretty lame, in my opinion. Britain promises to leave Canada's borders unchanged and abandon efforts to create an Indian state in the Northwest. And so on December 24th, 1814, we signed the Treaty of Ghent, which would be ratified the following February. Now, also at this time, the Hartford Convention is taking place from December 1814 to January 1815. And this was called by a group of New Englanders who protested the domination of the government by Virginia presidents. So we have Washington, we have John Adams, we have Jefferson, we have Madison, all Virginians. So New England's feeling a little slighted. They call for amending the Constitution to eliminate the 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves for representation and taxation. So basically, they want to eliminate slavery. They call for amending the Constitution so that it would require a 2/3 vote of Congress to admit new states, to declare war, and to restrict trade. Because remember, the New Englanders were really hurt by the trade restrictions, the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. And then there were also rumors that the delegates to this convention considered secession, but most historians have said that that is a myth. So there's one last great battle in the War of 1812. Since there were no cell phones, no internet, after the Treaty of Ghent is signed, not everyone finds out in time. And so what had happened here is that on January 8th, 1815, unaware that peace had been concluded, British forces mount a major attack on New Orleans, only to meet with defeat. I love when I rhyme. At the hands of future U.S. President Andrew Jackson's army. And news of the battle really boosted sagging U.S. morale, because let's face it, I mean, they burned our capital and left Americans kind of with a taste of victory, despite the fact that we had achieved really none of our pre-war objectives. So the effects of the war, it really confirmed the ability of a Republican democratic government to conduct a war. So you don't need a dictator. You don't need an emperor. You don't need a monarch to conduct a war. You can have a democratically elected government conduct a war. Andrew Jackson goes on to be a hero and later president. It broke up the remaining power and will of the Indians and opened up new lands for Americans to settle. The Federalist Party dies at this point. So the Treaty of Ghent ends decades of bitter fighting in the government and ushers in an era of good feelings. And this leads to the demise of the Federalist Party, which had been accused of being unpatriotic for its anti-war stance. And it also boosts national self-confidence and encourages the growing spirit of American expansionism, which would shape the rest of the 19th century. And that's probably one of the most important parts, is that America emerges with a new sense of nationalism and unity as a result of the War of 1812.